So just to keep time, then I will invite the first presenter to come in, Bryan, if the technical team can share the presentation. Thank you.
Great, good morning. Would it be possible to play the video presentation instead of doing it live? I'm happy to do it live if that's easier. But
technical team?
Great. Okay, should I introduce myself first though?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. So great to be here. My name is Bryan Galligan. I work with the Jesuit Justice and Ecology Network Africa based here in Nairobi, where I am our research and policy analyst for food and climate justice. And most of my own research focuses on both the ecology and ethics of small-scale fisheries. So today's presentation is more on the ethics side. And I'm looking forward to talking more about the topic and getting feedback and engaging with you all. So you can please play the presentation. Thanks for having me.
Bryan.
Blue justice and food sovereignty are two related frameworks that provide ethical guidance for ocean governance. They are more than just ideals to shoot for or sets of rules to be followed. Rather, they provide the specific type of ethical guidance that those of us conducting research and making policy in the Western Indian Ocean need. Guidance that identifies the challenges we face and points us toward meaningful change. Food sovereignty and blue justice invite us to begin our work by asking what kind of ocean we want. This goes far beyond mere inclusion in processes that are already underway. After explaining both of these terms and where they come from, I will briefly identify how they are operationalized and undermined in the Western Indian Ocean today, before closing with some comments about what they mean for governance in the region. Blue justice, which first appeared in the academic literature in 2019, is a new term, but it is heir to a long history of thought in the field of social ethics. It has even been described simply as social justice for small-scale fisheries, which, if accurate, would indicate that blue justice is not really a new concept at all. It is rather a transposition of an existing concept, social justice, into a new, blue context. Situating blue justice in this way allows us to see, despite claims that blue justice is so new as to be a conceptual infant, that it is really the fruit of literally thousands of years of ethical reflection. This long history also grounds the suggestion that we think of blue justice as having three components: distributive justice, procedural justice, and recognitional justice. Distributive justice is concerned primarily with who gets what, whether that what is a reference to power, financial resources, educational opportunities, or even a toxic waste dump in my backyard. Procedural justice is explicitly concerned with the power dynamics that often lead to unjust distributive outcomes. It invites us to ask who is marginalized and whose interests are prioritized in governance as well as knowledge production. Recognition, an often misunderstood but nonetheless crucial category of justice, directs our attention to a dynamic even deeper than questions of wealth and power. From the perspective of recognition, justice is not primarily concerned with how many goods a person should have, but rather with what kind of standing vis-a-vis other persons she deserves. When Svein Gentoft explained his demand for blue justice, he used the example of the marginalization of small-scale fisheries in the process of marine spatial planning. In this example, distributive justice would demand that small-scale fishers be allocated enough resources for their subsistence and livelihood needs. Procedural justice would require that small-scale fishers be granted priority standing over the claims of, say, a mining company that wanted to dump solid waste in active fishing grounds. And recognitional justice would require that less tangible aspects of fishing, for instance, its role as a constitutive part of culture and identity, be taken seriously. Food sovereignty is older than but closely related to the call for blue justice. I include it here as a companion concept to blue justice because it focuses our attention on the crucial role of our oceans as part of a food system that is badly in need of transformation. This focus on food is particularly important in a place like the Western Indian Ocean, where small-scale fishing takes place in a context that is often marked by poverty, food insecurity, and political marginalization. Both food sovereignty and blue justice arose as critical responses to the global economy, whether focusing on globalization and the commodification of food, or so-called blue growth. They both center small-scale food producers. But the most important contribution of food sovereignty for our purposes is that it provides us with more specific guidance than a simple demand to center justice principles in policymaking and research, as important as that may be. The use of the word sovereignty by food sovereignty movements represents and even recommends a political practice that displaces the singular sovereignty of the state. In the context of food movements, sovereignty becomes a way to claim lawful authority in order to both consolidate solidarity and engage with rivals. Sovereignty is something a community does, not something a community has. So, what does this mean for the Western Indian Ocean? First, as I have argued elsewhere, states' existing commitments to human rights and the Sustainable Development Goals require the prioritization of small-scale fisheries. This has been a consistent demand of advocates for blue justice and food sovereignty. But blue justice and food sovereignty also require that we go beyond mere prioritization. If we take these two frameworks seriously, and if we understand them as complementary, we can see that they invite us to strengthen the political claims, which is to say, sovereignty, of local communities over marine resources and markets. The Western Indian Ocean already has a strong record of empowering local communities in this way. Co-management has been implemented around the region, and we have come a long way in our understanding of what works and what doesn't. The turn towards locally managed marine areas is also encouraging, especially considering the importance of marine reserves for fisheries management and biodiversity conservation. It is not news to any of us, however, that social and ecological outcomes in the Western Indian Ocean are, at best, mixed. At worst, we might even say that local successes, like those we have seen with co-management and locally managed marine areas, are undermined, time and again, by factors beyond local control. Recent work has highlighted the effects of geopolitics on the regional management of transboundary fish stocks, the role of harmful subsidies in supporting unjust and unsustainable distant water fishing, and how neoliberal economic development consistently marginalizes small-scale fishers. Climate change is perhaps the best example of a threat with which local communities have to contend that nevertheless lies well beyond local control. Co-management, while promising, is not capable of directly addressing these threats. This is another place where blue justice and food sovereignty can provide helpful guidance. As I mentioned earlier, both frameworks arose as activist critiques of global political economy. Food sovereignty is concerned with establishing local control over food systems precisely because it sees hunger as the result of inequalities in power and resources. Blue justice is concerned with equity in the blue economy precisely because blue growth has been anything but equitable. Both point to the all-too-common story of national, transnational, or global concerns pursuing financial gain at the expense of coastal communities and ecosystems. Governing the Western Indian Ocean for food sovereignty and blue justice will require that we recognize the mismatch in scale between the most equitable innovations in ocean governance and many of the threats faced by coastal communities. The question we are invited to consider, then, is how we can support local communities in strengthening their political claims, their sovereignty, over the governance processes that mediate these large-scale threats. Those with the most to lose deserve a commensurate level of power, whether it be in formulating fishing access agreements, planning infrastructure development, or committing to climate policy. This type of procedural and structural innovation will help us change the conversation about the blue economy so that we begin by asking what kind of ocean we want, rather than attempting to squeeze so-called social inclusion into economic initiatives we already have.
Right. Okay, thank you very much for that presentation. I guess we have some few minutes for questions. Rebecca?
Yes, we have 5 minutes. No, I was just applauding.
Yeah, we've got 5 minutes for question answer time. So please, I've not seen any on my chart. So are there any questions at this point? Yes, we've got one from Nakshi. Please go ahead.
Hi, Bryan. Thank you for the great talk. I have a question about, you spoke about the mismatch of scales. Like, I was wondering, what are some of the ways you've seen that are effective in upscaling like local efforts? And how do you harmonize it when there are different hierarchies in governance structures in the WIO?
Yeah, thank you so much, Meenakshi, for that question. I think that's a very good and open question. And my biggest point is that I don't think we have, I think we're not asking the right question. So when I point out the mismatch in scale between kind of what I see as the progress we've made in terms of blue justice and food sovereignty, I think a lot of that has been at the local level. So I think what you're hinting at is, at least in the communities I'm most familiar with, and especially the one place where I work most consistently, the threats that people are seeing and facing are coming from their own national government, in our case, and these international global threats. So how do we harmonize that? How do we move past that? I don't have a recipe for that, but it's not going to come if we start, or I think what I would like to criticize is that, especially in terms of blue economic development, we kind of have these initiatives which are already in place, and we haven't stopped to ask about what are our ethical priorities here. And I think that's a really important step. Now, I think the other point that kind of comes out of blue justice and food sovereignty for our purposes here is that all of the kind of institutional arrangements that make democracy more accountable, that make government better, are going to be really helpful for governing our ocean as well. So there are transparency mechanisms, for instance, so here in Kenya that the government has introduced, where you can see like online portals, and you can look at different government processes. Everybody has access to these documents. On one level, some communities know about these, some don't. Sometimes these portals are like abused by the government. So there have been cases of them being used, but then in particular contentious cases, documents being pulled down. And then I think another key part of it is at the international level. So highlighting the abuses, especially of countries in the global north, when we talk about fishing, especially distant water fishing nations, and making public and transparent a lot of the activities that they get away with that they would not get away with if they were better known. I'm sorry, I don't have a better or more systematic answer to that question, but thank you so much.
All right, thank you. I can see Lucy, please. You can ask your question.
Hi, Bryan. Thank you so much for that really interesting presentation. So I think when I was reflecting on your talk this morning, I was thinking about all of the parallels and interesting aspects that we could learn from while we're now thinking about the final sessions that are under negotiation of the Biodiversity Bill in national jurisdiction. So I was just wondering whether you've sort of reflected on that. I know it's not small scale fisheries, but sort of share with us some of your insights and some of the aspects that we're still struggling with within that those negotiations, but of course are very pertinent to the region. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So the big caveat before I answer your question is that I am not an expert in the BBNJ negotiations or what's going on there. So I will just speak to what I do know, and then we can move on. But so one of my big concerns when it comes to international law, and this is true of UNCLOS, and I think this is true of a lot of the provisions of BBNJ that have been under contention, is that we get all of this nice language and then the actual structure of these agreements ends up so that the strong, enforceable, clear provisions benefit those with the power to shape the conventions. And then you might get lip service to kind of important social outcomes that is not actually legally binding. So if you read the document without paying attention to how kind of power is functioning or what the different legal provisions are enacting, you'll get a very different story. So I'm concerned about that dynamic in the negotiations of BBNJ, as I am in all kind of international negotiations. And then I think that something that other people have highlighted is the need for kind of more broader awareness and engagement. So I think some people have highlighted that particular developing states have not stepped up or have missed opportunities to assert their concerns in those negotiations. So I think that's kind of another piece. I'm sorry, I can't speak more fully to that, but thank you.
All right, thank you, Bryan. I think we'll stop that for questions. Doesn't mean that that's the end of all the questions, Bryan, so you hang around. Please put your questions in the chat. I will be able to forward them to Bryan so that when we have time at the end of this, he'll be able to address them.